Welcome to our first Q&A of 2024. Happy New Year to everyone. I want to remind everyone that our primary goal is to educate ourselves, our clients, and our investors. These sessions are to empower us to better serve and guide those who rely on our expertise. We bring experts to you so we learn to navigate our clients' obstacles and become the best problem solver and know where and who to refer for solutions. With that being said, we have today here attorney Ernie Garcia.
Hi, Elda. Thank you for
Hi.
having me here. It's really great to be here. Happy New Year.
Yes, likewise. Okay, so he's going to be talking to us about the importance of having an attorney and what an attorney can do for us in our situations and problems. So for our clients, we want to make sure that if we're talking about pre-foreclosures, which he's going to talk in a little bit, how to go about them and what are the problems that we may have. So with that being said, Ernie, how do we go about pre-foreclosures and what does it mean to be pre-foreclosed?
Well, it comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. Essentially, when a property owner has property where they find themselves in default or in the immediate need for transfer of title for whatever reason, sometimes a buyer can find an advantageous avenue to acquire property quickly and potentially at a discount. And so these deals sometimes look extremely attractive to buyers, but they come with complications. So sometimes the problems that the seller has are not as clear and on the table as maybe a knowledgeable buyer would like for them to be. So it's helpful for that buyer to ask specific questions and to make sure they know every facet of the deal, including what happens after the deal closes.
Okay, so what can those problems look like?
Well, let me talk, for example, one specific scenario. So imagine that you have a distressed seller, someone who's got property but has fallen behind. They're not set for foreclosure, but they can feel the heat because they're getting letters. They know they're a few months behind. And the way they see it, there's no solution but to sell. So it turns out that a buyer finds this property and immediately wants to jump on it. They make a deal, they go to a closing, but then that seller has some seller's remorse and decides, you know what, I'm not moving. What's a buyer going to do in this situation? They've already closed on the deal, they already have title, but that seller says, I'm not going anywhere. If a buyer hasn't planned for that as a potential outcome, they're already 3 or 4 steps back.
Right, because they're still paying on this mortgage. They're still making the payment on whatever. They received a loan, I assume?
Potentially, yeah. And so maybe they've covered taxes, maybe they've cleared out debts. There were associated other encumbrances on the property. They've invested money and they have no benefit from it because they don't have possession.
Had they been prepared for this, what are the procedures that you would have taken?
So let's talk about a couple of things that they could have done to protect themselves. Number one, the easiest one is to demand at the time of closing that the property be delivered without anybody there and without any personal property remaining, a completely vacant property. But sometimes the parties say, well, I can't move until after I've sold because I need to take the proceeds from the sale to purchase my own home. And if that's reasonable for the buyer, one thing they can do to protect themselves is to have a temporary lease in place. Now, if you have a temporary lease in place, that rent value should be high enough that it makes the seller uncomfortable. It should be a disincentive for staying put because every day or every week or every month they're paying a higher than market value rent rate to stay there, thus motivating them to find their new spot.
Okay, does this contract, does it come out from you? Do you prepare this contract for them? Can an agent do this?
Certainly an agent can, certainly an attorney can. Either of us would be qualified to draft this very temporary short-term lease that usually runs sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. And the terms are, again, drafted in a way that should motivate the seller to find their new home quickly. Ideally, you want them on their way out of the door on the day of closing, but if that can't be accomplished, you're gonna wanna have a temporary lease in place in order to serve as that motivation.
Okay, So they cannot do, can the new seller, the one that is purchasing the new home, can they do something like on the lease, maybe on the contract, state that they have to leave?
Well, inevitably, leaving is part of the deal.
Right.
And so, one way to do that is to have a definitive end date to the lease. When I say short term, it could be 3 weeks, it could be 3 months, depending on the way the deal is formed. But whatever the parties agree to, it should be structured in a way that is advantageous to the buyer and not advantageous to the seller. Imagine this. Imagine a seller selling a property and then paying a less than market value to simply stay put. Why would they have any incentive to leave? Everything they find is a higher and higher cost, but if they stay in their own home, they stay at a lower cost. And so you have to think in terms of the disincentive. If you're going to make this an option, make sure that it's an expensive option, that the longer they employ, the more it'll cost, and that it is uncomfortable for them to stay indefinitely.
Okay, so for a regular closing, it usually takes anywhere from 35 days to 45 days if it's just a regular transaction. Mm-hmm. How long does it usually take to do a pre-foreclosure? How long do they have to be out of the property I mean, I know it kind of depends on how many letters they've received from their mortgage. Is that correct?
It does. And so the thing about a pre-foreclosure is that it's less certain because it is so open-ended. You know, some of these can go on for years, I've seen. You know, depending on how you navigate with your lien holder, depending on how aggressively they're going to seek to foreclose, some of these just go on and on and on and on. So the best thing for a party to do is to set strict limits and to say, I will only accept these number of days, and after which I will take action. For example, with an eviction. And so if a sale has transpired, we've got a closing, title has transferred over to the buyer, it's probably best for the buyer to definitively and in writing let the seller know, I want possession by date X. And if I don't have possession by date X, the buyer is taking steps to recover possession. In my world, that means the eviction process. If a buyer simply won't go, despite what the reason is, the fact is the transaction closed, the allotted extra time has expired, it's time for the buyer to take possession. If you let them stay indefinitely, they will. Mm-hmm. And that sets you back. You're paying taxes, you're paying your mortgage, you're deriving no benefit from your purchase.
Okay, sounds good. So the invisible buyer, can you tell us a little bit about who the invisible buyer is?
Ooh, this unfortunately happens and it's a heartbreaker. So let's say instead we don't have a person who's in default. They own the property free and clear. And they just said, you know what, I've had this forever. I inherited it from mom, or, you know, I've just had it for a long time and I'm no longer interested in this property. And they say, hey, I know you're interested. How's about buying this property from me? And you as a motivated buyer, you think, wow, I've got a heck of a deal in my hands and I'm going to take this. You buy it, you go to closing, title's yours. But one thing that you knew about was that someone's living in that property. It's a brother or a cousin or an uncle. And your understanding is they've been living there for free because grandma wanted them to stay there and didn't ever want to charge them rent, or because mom and dad had a deal with the brother, and now you have to evict them. And you go through the normal process of filing the eviction, sending the notices, filing with the court, showing up to trial. But at the day of trial, you show up and they come in with a single sheet of paper that says they bought the property years ago. They entered into some deal with the seller. What do? It wasn't recorded. There's no record of it in the county. But now you just paid money for property that may not belong to you.
What happens then?
It's a mess. I'm telling you, it's always a mess. The Justice Court does not have jurisdiction to move forward in a case like this. If there's an issue of title where it appears that the tenant actually owns the property, they simply cannot be evicted. A higher court has to make that decision. And what happens usually is somebody, the buyer or the landlord or the tenant, will file a lawsuit in district court for determination of the title. Generally speaking, it's going to be the new buyer because he wants this determination made quickly and he wants possession quickly. But the process is not quick. So if you don't investigate it, you don't ask enough questions about why that person's there, and you don't specifically say, he's not going to make some claim to ownership, is he? If you don't ask those questions, you could step in. Now, could the deal be undone and could the sale be unwound? Absolutely it could, because it appears that maybe the seller didn't have authority to sell. That's potentially a fraud claim. Could you work things out with the tenant who claims he's an owner? Absolutely, but that's going to cost more money. And so you've got a hornet's nest here because you didn't ask enough questions about the person occupying the property. Sometimes there's some secret deal that you have no knowledge of that's going to spoil your ability to make money on what otherwise would be an excellent deal.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so can you share an experience, a situation where you had both family members and the seller in district court?
Yes.
How was that approached?
It's a challenge because the family member who's making the claim has some evidence. Usually they paid something, or sometimes it's a matter of taxes. Sometimes they made payments directly to the mortgage company. And this is evidence that appears like a buyer might do, right? And unfortunately, when you have a deal between family members, it's usually informal. There's not a whole lot of writing. There's not a whole lot of documents or closing that was set up. Sometimes it's as simple as a little document written by hand. Hey, if you do this, I'll sell the property to you. Or if you do this, you'll own the property after 30 years, right? Those kinds of documents or those kinds of statements can themselves create what we call in the legal profession a cloud on the title. And if you have a clouded title, you don't have a clean title, and you can't transfer it. In this case, you can't even take possession of it.
What happens with the money that has already been paid for from the...
Well, that seller got the money at closing, and they're entitled to it because it appeared that they had the right to it. The district court should also include that seller, and you should probably sue them for fraud. Because if they had knowledge, and clearly if they were part of that original transaction, if they had knowledge of that transaction and did not disclose it to you, naturally they were selling you property that they had already sold once. That's invalid, and that it probably amounts to fraud. Now, it could be that the document itself is a fraud, that the family member just made the whole thing up, which is another reason you want to add the seller in, because you want him to testify against his own family member. That bolsters your claim and hopefully speeds up the process. But if he says, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that, that could totally jeopardize your right to title and, again, compromise your position because you paid out or you're obligated to a third party on a note, and that guy's got the money.
Okay, so to backtrack, how do we prevent this? Just asking the questions, sitting down with the seller, the new seller?
Absolutely. And so in this case, you would ask questions of the seller, but you'd also go and interview the occupant, that family member who's there. And you simply ask, hey, how's it going? I'm purchasing this property. Very quickly, the conversation will change to, no, you're not. I own this property. Look at this. I've got this piece of paper. Back in 1989, I bought this house. That stops everything dead in its tracks. But if you go and you talk, oh yeah, I've been leasing this property since or my grandmother let me stay here for free, I've never paid rent. You kind of get these details out in the open. Don't presume anything. Always presume if someone's there, they might have an ownership interest, especially if you know the facts are, well, they've been there for 15 years, 20 years, right? That leads people to believe this is their property, and they might be right.
Wow, that's scary. Can you discuss any instances where maybe a former owner fought fiercely for their occupied property?
Oh.
Post pre-foreclosure?
Well, this is actually after a foreclosure has happened. So there's a couple of instances where this happens, and it's actually quite common. So let's say you go to the foreclosure sale. Mm-hmm. So now it's not pre-foreclosure. Now it's not a regular transaction where you go to a closing. Now you're going to a foreclosure, and you turn out to be the highest bidder. You buy the property, you pay all the money, you get the title, and then you walk to the property, you knock on the door, and wouldn't you know it, the former owner is still occupying, but they have no idea why you're knocking on their door. They'll tell you something like this: there's no way you could foreclose on me. My mortgage is 100% current. Get off my property. Well, what you know is that you bought this at a tax foreclosure or an HOA foreclosure. It has nothing to do with the mortgage. But they're going to claim, you're not getting my house, my mortgage is current. And every time you try to sue them, they show up to court and they're fighting you every step of the way. The truth is, everybody who is sued in the eviction court is going to have an opportunity to make their defense heard to that justice court. And in this case, you're going to have someone who's going to make the claim that they cannot be foreclosed. Now, what they don't know is that multiple entities that are attached to real property can foreclose. And if a person is in default, that's going to happen, especially if the right notices go out. But that doesn't stop them from mounting a defense or filing an appeal or filing a second appeal, which is entirely possible. And they drag things out, not for a few weeks, we're talking for months, sometimes over a year, because of what they're convinced of. Now, here's another facet to consider. Let's say you have an HOA foreclosure. There's a right of redemption. You have a tax foreclosure. There is a statutory right of redemption. And it may be that you bought your property subject to one of these rights, and that the foreclosed party says, nope, I'm going to exercise my right. You don't have any rights here, because within 6 months or 2 years, depending on what type of foreclosure, I can still pay the fees entirely and recover the title. So if you're not aware of these things, you really have to educate yourself on what could happen at an HOA or a tax foreclosure. And even if it's a mortgage foreclosure, you got to be aware that sometimes people stick around and fight. They are not willing to just leave without putting up a fight. And all that has to be part of your calculation when you're buying property in this way.
So one thing that I caught is that there's several types of foreclosures.
Yes.
There's an HOA foreclosure, tax foreclosure, and mortgage foreclosure. If for some reason they are doing a HOA foreclosure or tax foreclosure, at what point can they hire you, for instance, for your service?
So you're saying that the buyer has already purchased the property at foreclosure. Mm-hmm. Well, it might help to have an attorney contact the former owner with a letter of representation and let them know we are now the holders of the title. And in the letter, explain what the law says about how title transfers, and even explain that even if your mortgage is current, that has no bearing on the fact that your homeowners association or the taxing entity has foreclosed and now the title has transferred to my client. These kinds of things either A, cause that party to understand that the game is lost and that it's time for them to leave, especially even if they hold a right of redemption but have no ability to pay what is owed. Or B, they're going to contact their own attorney, and that attorney is going to inform them of exactly what I said in my letter and its validity. But they'll also explain to them potentially what their options are and how they could resolve it. And if it turns out they can't pay the amount that's owed, the reason they're in this mess is because they lack funds. They can't pay what's owed, and then maybe explain what their options are. Now, we find it helpful when there's another attorney there, because then we can coordinate together and hopefully resolve things in a matter of weeks instead of months and years.
Wow, okay. So the investor special, tenants included. What is, yes. So talk a little bit about that. Let me know what that means.
So sometimes you're looking for property and you find property, and not only is it occupied, but it's occupied by tenants. And if you're a landlord and you're in the landlord game and you find yourself, hey, I've got 3 or 4 of these, I'm a pro, I know what I'm doing, you might find a property with a motivated seller who's already got tenants there. Well, what kinds of things should you ask? What kinds of things must you ask before you buy a property like this? Right off the bat, you need to know, is there a written lease in place? I don't know how many times I've seen landlords come in, well, I bought this property 4 years ago, there was no lease, or the lease was old and lost. Well, if there was no lease in place, there always is a lease in place. it's an oral agreement if there never, ever, ever was a writing. If there was once a written lease that expired, that lease still controls, but it's probably lapsed into a month to month. And so the best thing for a new owner to do is simply put a new lease in the hands of that tenant and say, I'm going to terminate whatever your prior lease was, whether it was oral or written. I'm going to terminate that, and here's a brand new lease for you. You've got 30 days to look it over. There's a new rent amount. There are new terms. I wanted 6 months. I wanted 12 months. I wanted 18 months. But whatever those terms are, this is what I'm offering to you. If you accept it, great. However, if you reject it in 30 days, your prior lease is terminated and I'm coming for the property. And by situating yourself in this way, you're likelier to make money. If you rely solely on their records, their lease, you have minimal protection, especially if the entire transaction was oral.
Okay, so we're talking about the landlord's benefits. What about if someone is purchasing a property that has a tenant that had no lease agreement?
Well, that's where you know that there was some kind of deal between them and the former owner. That owner sells to me, the new buyer. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and announce myself as the new owner to that tenant. But I'm going to do it all in writing. I'm going to send a letter. I'm not just going to go knock on the door and have a conversation. While that's also helpful, you always, always, always want to establish in writing all of this communication. So double it, send it in the mail, and then go and personally have the conversation. And then let them know, I understand either you did not have a formal lease or that whatever the lease is now month to month. Here, by the way, is my new lease. If you're interested in signing it, we can talk about it. If you're not, here's my notice of termination in 30 days. You have to leave.
Can the new seller speak to the tenant before purchasing the property? Is that legal?
Oh, it's absolutely legal. And this happens from time to time. The seller goes and tells the tenant, hey, I'm selling the property, you got to go. Unfortunately, what ends up happening in these situations is, number one, they stop paying rent. Number two, they become hostile. They start ghosting everybody, the former seller, the new owner. Nobody hears from the tenant ever again. And so do I recommend this necessarily? No. It's not good to burn bridges, but I'll tell you this. If you've got a motivated seller, it's probably because there's already problems between them and the tenant. Stuff they're not telling you about. Maybe they've destroyed the property, or maybe they haven't paid rent in months, and this owner is frustrated. That's why you're getting such a good deal, is because you're getting a terrible tenant. So you always have to presume that whatever the prior owner had was not worth keeping, and so you're not going to maintain the status quo. You got to go in there and actively issue a new lease with new terms that are favorable to you. If it's below market, it's at market now. Maybe even a little above market if you know this is a terrible tenant who's got a terrible history. Maybe you go to the property and you see firsthand destruction, damage, people I don't know, dogs all over the place. You know, these are all signs to you that you probably need to move on from this tenant. You know, it's not always that you get a tenant gift wrapped with a bow and they're the perfect tenant.
Right.
Why would that seller want to leave that tenant?
Right.
It's not usually the case. Usually they're motivated because the tenant is terrible and they don't know what to do about it.
So how do you handle cases where a tenant changes the locks and doesn't allow anyone to come in?
Yeah, this is unfortunately one of those complicated things where you buy the property, you expect to be able to go and maybe inspect, you expect to be able to go and communicate with the new tenant because you're the new owner, but you find now that the key that you were given doesn't do anything. And you knock, 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 and nobody answers. You know people are in there because you can hear them, but nobody answers the door. This is part of what I was talking about, where they totally ghost you. But on top of that, even if they're all gone, you can't go in and check to see what the condition of the property is. That's a huge violation. Now, if there was a written lease that allowed you to enter, one thing I would send for sure is a notice of default and said, look, I now own this lease. You are in default by number one, changing the locks, and number two, by disallowing me entry. I would like to come in at this date. You may ask yourself, why would you communicate in this way at all with the tenant? Well, basically what you want to do is you want to lay a foundation for the eviction court. This isn't for them. It's not even for you, right? Because if they're being that hostile where they totally shut you out, you're not likely going to get an opportunity to go and inspect. But by sending these notices to them, once you do file your eviction, even if they continue to pay you the rent, you may still file an eviction on the basis that you are disallowed from entering the property or that they illegally changed the locks and you don't have access. That may either A, motivate them to be more accommodating and give you a key or allow you to come in. But usually what it means is you have to force them out because, again, they just do not respond. They shut you out completely. And you're only left with the courts as a potential way to recover your property and then begin rehabbing it so that you can lease it out to tenants that you approve.
Okay, so I have a question, and this actually happened to a client of mine. The repairs. Mm-hmm. The tenant leaves, but they're so upset. They're pissed off, and they just decided to put concrete through the toilet. It actually happened. Mm-hmm. What happens next? I mean, you can't really sue them because they don't have a lot, right? What do you sue them for?
So I always tell landlords the following. Let's presume you inherited this tenant. It's nobody you ever vetted. It's no one you ever approved. The moment you got there, you set things in motion to get rid of them. And that made them angry, right? They'd been there for 4 or 5 years. They figured this was their home. They continued to tender the rent, but you said, no, I'm sorry. I really just want to get possession. For whatever reason, you are now at odds with this person, and they take it so hard that they actively destroy the property. You have a couple of options. Number one, you can fix everything and then sue them for that amount. Or number two, you just forget about it. You can just understand this is the cost of doing business. Because the truth is, if you sue them, let's say for $50,000 in damages, but they don't have $20 in their pocket, what good is a $50,000 lawsuit? Especially if it cost you $5,000 or $10,000 to get it in your own legal costs. You know, why spend all that money on top of everything you spent for the repair against someone who we call a judgment-proof tenant? A judgment-proof tenant is someone you could sue them for $1 million gajillion and never get a penny of it. Now, of course, if this particular person was foolish enough to damage the property, but they do have assets or they do have a good job, then definitely you go after them, you sue them, and then you go and you execute that lawsuit against their accounts, their property, if they have registered vehicles, or perhaps they own non-exempt assets of some kind that you can seize and have the constable sell at auction to recover the funds of the judgment. But generally speaking, the people who do this are not people of means. They don't care about their criminal history. They don't care about their rental history. They don't care about the debt. They do it because they can essentially get away with it. And if you've purchased a property with a problematic tenant like this, it might be best for you to just take a deep breath and say, okay, it happens sometimes. It's a loss that I'll take, but I'm gonna recover from this eventually. I just gotta let this go because there's no way I'll ever collect any of this from that tenant.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's very sad.
It's sad, but you know what? It's a reality that you know, people will do bad things or you will experience loss. That's the business. You know, not every situation is I put $100,000 in and I got $200,000 out. Sometimes you put $100,000 in and you lose $35,000 before you begin to make money, right? The good thing about real estate is in the long game, you can recover from even that kind of loss, right? But maybe in the short term, it's going to cost you a little bit. You roll with it. If it's in your long-term plan, you're still going to make money. You'll be fine.
Okay, great. Vacant land that isn't vacant.
Yeah, that happens. In fact, I had a client who bought a lot, and wouldn't you know, when they went to go check it out, someone was camped out on their lot. What do? There's no home. There's no structure there. There's no plumbing or electricity. Someone had a trailer that was hitched to a truck, and they're parked there, and that's where they are residing, and when you ask them to leave, they say no. Well, unfortunately, Texas law says that even that guy, the squatter, even that guy is entitled to the same due process of a rent-paying leased tenant. You have to send the notice.
No way.
You absolutely have to file with the Justice Court. You have to make sure they're served on time. You have to show up and get an order from the court saying they can be removed. It doesn't sound fair. It's terrible when it happens. It's rare. But when it does happen, they are entitled to the exact same rights. Whether that's they broke into a house, an established residency. This also happens where people see an empty property that's been on the market for a month and they say, free house, how nice. They sneak in, they write up a fake lease. So when the constable comes to remove them, they say, no, I have a lease. And the constable automatically shuts it down and says, landlord, I'm sorry, you say this, they say this. They're due the process of eviction, even when they're scamming.
Wow, I'm glad you mentioned that because I actually had a seller that we found someone was living inside the home. And so, but every time we would go, there was nobody and they would hide their items in the attic.
Oh.
So this does happen. I mean, it just happened last year to one of my sellers. So you've got to know who to call. You've got to know, what your rights are as a seller.
You also have to know what you can't do. And so what you can't do is go and grab their stuff and toss it out or force, put your hands on them. I mean, that's assault potentially. And so, the state of Texas gives a lot of deference to whoever is in possession at the time. They will assume they have the right to be there. Until you prove otherwise in the court, that's the presumption. And you just have to deal with it. How do you prepare for it? Well, I tell sellers, one thing you can do is set up a Ring camera on your property. That way you know who's coming in and out of your property. If you're not doing that basic small thing, you're setting yourself up for somebody occupying your space. If you've got cameras on the perimeter of your property, just to check who's coming in and out, especially if you are an investor who lives out of state or you live out of town, these small little things you can do. Another thing, very easy, get to know your neighbors. Get to know the neighbors because the neighbors are going to be the first ones to rat out somebody who they don't know, who they probably don't trust. And they're going to give you a call and say, I saw someone come in. Did you rent this house? Did you lease it to somebody? And you say, no, I did not. Not yet. And then you go and then you deal with it immediately. Because once a person has established residency, which is hard to define, what do? Well, once you've moved all your stuff in, if you've got a fake lease, that helps. But if it's just you in a sleeping bag, it's a lot easier to claim vagrant, breaking and entering, trespasser than if you've got a bed and a table and clothing in the closets. Now it looks like you reside there and you got to go through the eviction process.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So Ernie, you told us a lot, you taught us a lot, but just basically give us a list of all of the things that you can help any agents or any buyers or sellers out there.
Well, first off, it's imperative that you ask all of the right questions. And if you don't know the right questions to ask in any given situation, whether it's pre-foreclosure, post-foreclosure, whether it's a transaction where property is currently occupied, or whether it's a transaction where the land is otherwise presumably unoccupied, but you have not seen that land, you always want to ask all of the right questions before. If you don't know them, seek out a realtor with experience in your area. Seek out somebody with knowledge of the market. Seek out an attorney. Seek out other people who do exactly what you do. If you're an investor who has 1 to 3 homes, find an investor who's got 10 to 30 homes. The more people that you surround yourself with, the better off you're going to be because you're going to ask questions and then hear responses you didn't even expect.
That's awesome. How do we get a hold of you?
So I can be reached at my office. I office here in Houston on the South Loop. I'm right near NRG Stadium at 2626 South Loop West, Suite 630. But the easiest way to get a hold of me is through email. info@attorneydaniel.com. info@attorneyeg.com, info@attorneyeg.com. Easiest way to get a hold of me. Our phone number, you can call us or text us, 832-305-7694. That's another way. We check these things all the time. If you want more information just like this, I've got over 400 helpful landlord videos on my YouTube channel. Just look me up. I'm Ernie Garcia, landlord attorney.
He is also bilingual, so he does speak Spanish, right?
Sí hablo español.
Hablo español.
Para todos esos clientes que necesitan hablar en español.
Yay. So now we know who to refer to. Give us a call if you have any questions. My name is Elda. Thank you for joining. See you next time.